This talk is titled The Failure of Ottoman Strategy at Malta and Dissension amongst the Ottoman Command. I want to discuss the blatant tactical errors on the parts of the Turks at the 1565 siege of Malta and their consequences. This is something I haven't seen anyone go over in any great detail in any of the lectures or books on the siege, so it's something I want to spend a little bit of time on for anyone that's interested. So my first source on this is the first-hand account written by Francisco Balbi. Balbi being an Italian soldier and arquebusier serving with the Spanish contingent at the siege. So he wrote a diary of the events that took place, and in my opinion, his writing is the best source that we have on the siege. His diary was written in Spanish and was translated by historian of the siege, Ernley Bradford, who also wrote his own book, which is basically a commentary on Balbi's account. Balbi is a great source on this subject because not only does he go into detail on the dissension in the Ottoman command, but he's also very clear on where he's getting this information from. So firstly, I'll give the basic details as to the structure of the Ottoman command at Malta, and then I'm going to go into how the system rapidly broke down. And I think that you'll agree with me by the end of this talk that the Turks' failure to take Malta basically boils down to the tactical blunders that took place within the first weeks of the siege. I will also argue that if the orders given by Suleiman upon departure from Constantinople had been obeyed by his generals from the beginning, then these enormous tactical mistakes wouldn't have occurred. So it's my opinion that the Turkish failure to take Malta in 1565, which should have been a relatively straightforward task, is primarily the fault of Admiral Piali Pasha, whose flawed strategy in choosing to attack Fort St. Elmo, and that combined with his inability to effectively blockade the islands, are the main causes for the Turkish defeat. The leadership of the Ottoman forces were supposed to be arranged like this, as was the decree of Suleiman. So Admiral Piali Pasha was to be in charge of the fleet and all naval operations, and Mustafa Pasha being in charge of the land army and everything that pertained to it. Both commanders were under orders to wait for the arrival of the corsair Dragut, who was coming to the siege from Tripoli, whereas the rest of the fleet was obviously coming from Constantinople. Balbi writes in his diary that both Piali and Mustafa Pasha had promised not to engage any of the fortifications on Malta until Dragut had arrived. So the main Turkish fleet arrived at Malta on the 18th of May, but Dragut didn't get there until the 2nd of June. So it's not clear to me whether Dragut's delayed arrival was expected and the Turkish command jumped the gun, so to speak, in attacking St. Elmo, or whether Dragut was unexpectedly late and they carefully decided to proceed without him. My personal feeling is that Dragut's arrival 2 weeks after that of the main fleet meant that the siege had to commence without him. I find it difficult to imagine that it would have been feasible for the entire Turkish army to wait around for Dragut having already landed and deployed. So in my view, the error is not necessarily the prematurity of the attack, but the fact that Piali's will to attack the wrong target prevailed. So nearly all of this is coming from Balbi's account, and he specifically tells us that the dissension amongst the Turkish command was made known to them by the deserter known as Alfonso the Andalusian. So the background of Alfonso is that he was a Spanish soldier who came with the Turks to Malta. He was certainly of Christian ancestry, which he makes clear to La Valette, and he deserts the Turks and flees to the garrison at St. Elmo on the night of May the 27th during the Turkish bombardment. So I quickly just want to go through a little bit of the desertions at the Siege of Malta, because we have records of multiple desertions on both sides. Now this could be given a better treatment in its own video, its own talk, but I will give a couple of details here. So firstly, I would say that desertions are often associated with cowardice. And surely cowardice was a motivation behind many of the desertions at the siege. However, there are some instances where deserters show incredible bravery and integrity, Alfonso of Andalusia being one of those examples. So Alfonso deserts very early on in the siege, and he deserts at a point where it looks as though the Turks are certainly going to win. There's no indication or any reason to believe that Alfonso is trying to save his own life by doing this. He actually puts himself in immense danger by crossing over to the defenders. This takes place on Mount Shibarus, in the Turkish trenches outside the walls of St. Elmo. So Alfonso goes to exit the trench system in order to approach the fort, but he's apprehended by Turkish sentries. They challenge him as to what he's doing, and he tells them he's going to shoot at the defenders' boats crossing over from Fort St. Angelo to reinforce St. Elmo. The sentries accept his reasoning and allow him to proceed. Once he's out of their sight, he then fires his gun a few times to reduce any suspicions, and when he has an opportune moment, he runs to the walls of St. Elmo, and after convincing the defenders of his intentions, a rope is thrown to him and he's allowed to enter the fort. Now that's as much as I want to discuss Alfonso on this video. However, I would like to cover desertions at the siege in detail in a separate lecture. What I will say though is that Alfonso fought bravely for the knights during the rest of the siege and was actually wounded twice. And according to Balbi, he gives a valiant account of himself. So this is all coming from Balbi's account, but if there's anything else on Alfonso of Andalusia in the other sources, I would like to know about it because I am interested in this guy. Another source we have on this is a Neapolitan deserter who fled the Turks at the first possible opportunity he got. This was on the 19th of May, so the day after the Turkish fleet arrives, this guy bails straight away. He deserted to the knights and gave La Valette a good deal of information about the Turkish intentions, their numbers, their provisions, and he gives details about the descent between the Turkish commanders. So as you can see, this guy wasted no time in deserting. I mean, he'd not even been in Malta for 2 days before he ditched the Turks and goes over to the knights. Going back to the Turkish command then, so prior to the arrival of Dragut, the two commanders were in disagreement about which fortress to invest, despite their instructions not to begin attacking without Dragut, those instructions coming from Suleiman. Balbi records in his diary a rumour that when the Turkish fleet arrived at Malta, May the 18th, Mustafa Pasha produced a firman from which the Sultan gave him power over and above those of Admiral Piali. So naturally Piali is disgusted at the way this was concealed from him until the last minute, and if this isn't just a rumour and did actually happen, you can see how it would contribute to the deterioration of the relationship between Suleiman's commanders. The main dispute early on in the siege is that Piali Pasha wanted to attack St. Elmo in order to give the Turks access to the Marsa Macheto, a strategy that Mustafa Pasha did not agree with. The Turkish fleet was anchored at Marsaschlock in the south of the island, which is a decent harbour. However, Piali was aware of the potential danger that the Scirocco could pose to the fleet if it remained there. The Marsa Macheto was much safer anchorage for them, but the Turkish fleet could not enter the harbour since it was guarded by Fort St. Elmo. Aside from gaining access to the Marsa Macheto for the fleet, the capture of Fort St. Elmo would provide very little, if any, tactical advantage for the Turks. St. Elmo is much smaller and had a much smaller garrison than the Knights' headquarters of Fort St. Angelo across the Grand Harbour. Piali reasoned that capturing St. Elmo would be a quick and easy objective, and that he would have safety for the fleet and would be free to make a move on St. Angelo or Medina. What Piali did not expect was a prolonged siege from where Valette was able to reinforce St. Elmo daily. The Turks' failure to isolate the fortress and stop reinforcements coming from St. Angelo are the primary reasons for the defenders being able to hold out for 30 days and inflict thousands of casualties on the attackers. Balbi comments that if St. Elmo had been cut off from St. Angelo from the beginning of the siege, as it was on the 20th of June, it would have fallen in a matter of days. But that's not how it went down, and it was eventually conquered at an enormous cost to the Turks. Estimates put the Turkish losses at 6,000 dead. As it happens, it fell on the 23rd of June, 3 days after it was cut off from St. Angelo. Apart from giving their fleet access to the safe anchorage of the Marsa Macheto, the reduction of St. Elmo did allow the Turks to bring around 100 ships overland into the Grand Harbour to attack St. Michael from the sea on the 15th of June. Balbi is getting this information from deserters, credits this idea to Mustafa Pasha, But ultimately this attack fails and the boats are transported back to the Marsa Macheto. Dragut, when he arrived on June the 2nd, lamented the commencement of the Turkish investment of St. Elmo, but deemed it shameful for them to cease the attack once they had begun. Mustafa Pasha opted to take Medina and the north of the island, which would have completely isolated the knights in Birgu and Senglia. If the north of Malta was taken, then it would have been impossible for a relief force to come to the aid of the knights. As we know, the main relief force came by the way of Medina. With the knights besieged in Birgu and St. Michael and the rest cooped up in Medina, it seems utterly incredible that the relief force was allowed to land and that it was able to land so easily. The Turks had complete control of the archipelago in terms of naval supremacy, with no one able to challenge the blockade. But Valette still repeatedly managed to get dispatches through to Sicily, and then 2 relief forces were able to land unopposed to the dismay of the attackers. This begs the question, why was the blockade unable to cut Valette's lines of communication? According to high-ranking deserters, Piali Pasha repeatedly emphasises the importance of keeping his fleet safe, and it is clear that he is extremely nervous about ensuring the well-being of his ships. The harbour at Marsa Schlock is by all accounts a very good harbour. I've been there myself and seen it. Today it's Malta's largest port. But even having his fleet anchored in the safety of a harbour like that was not enough for him. He was adamant that they must take the Marsa Macheto for the guaranteed safety of his ships, no matter the cost to their army. The immense cost of the reduction of tiny St. Elmo to the Turks, in my opinion, is a large contributor to the overall failure of the campaign. A large portion of their losses at St. Elmo were Janissaries, with an estimated 3,000 dead, the Janissaries being the elite troops of the Turkish army. Now, it didn't help that the Janissaries didn't really wear armour and were incredibly flammable and susceptible to incendiary weapons in their flowing robes, but that is not something that I'm going to go into right now. The estimated Turkish losses during the siege of St. Elmo is 6,000 men. The Turkish morale was weakened, to say the least, by how unnecessarily difficult it was for them to finally take the small fort. The fortifications at St. Michael and St. Angelo are massive compared to those of St. Elmo, and these were being continually strengthened whilst the Turks wasted ammunition, wasted soldiers on the tiny fortress across the harbour. Mustafa Pasha is quoted by Balbi upon inspecting St. Elmo after its capture as saying, "Allah, if so small a son has cost us so dear, what price shall we have to pay for so large a father?" Ultimately, the Turks never made a direct assault on the walls of St. Angelo, as they couldn't get through Valette's defences at Birgu. If the Turks hadn't hastily and erroneously attacked St. Elmo, they would have been able to mount a far more effective assault on the fortifications at Senglia and Birgu. They would have had a full force of men with high morale, a full arsenal of artillery, and the knights would have had a month less to prepare for the coming Turkish attack. In Piali's defence, you might say that St. Elmo should have been taken in 3 or 4 days, and maybe that's true. But the Turkish failure to cut the garrison off from St. Angelo caused the defenders to be able to hold out for 30 days. I'm going to play devil's advocate and give Piali Pasha give the devil his due. So, it's easy to sit here 500 years later and pull apart Piali's strategy. We do not know the very specific orders given to him by the Sultan in regards to the fleet. There's more to it than what we know. He may have been given very clear instructions that the preservation of the fleet was more important than the capture of Malta. We simply don't know. What we do know, according to the various deserters that Balbi records, is that Piali was very nervous and very cautious about the well-being of the fleet, and that is what pushed his decision-making in attacking Fort St. Elmo first, and may give an explanation as to why his blockade of the archipelago was so ineffective. Some blame may be attributed to Mustafa Pasha, who had the right idea tactically, with Dragut in agreement, but allowed Piali to carry out his will, despite the fact that it's alleged that Mustafa Pasha had the higher command. It must also be said that although the Turkish plan of action proved to be shambolic, Valette conducted his defence of Malta basically perfectly, flawlessly. If Valette had made any kind of tactical mistake, I believe that Malta would have fallen regardless of the flaws in the Turkish strategy. They had the numbers, they had the weight of artillery. Even after breaking themselves against the walls of St. Elmo, they still ought to have won. It's estimated that the Turks lost 25,000 men during their failed campaign at Malta, as well as whatever artillery they lost, ammunition they used, the other supplies, etc. This was an enormous campaign, and the logistical costs alone would have been absolutely astronomical. When the two pashas returned to Constantinople, the Sultan was obviously furious with this humiliating defeat and vowed to return to Malta in 1566 himself to lead another campaign against the Knights. The lives of Mustafa and Piali Pasha were spared, but unfortunately, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent died in Hungary before he could return against the Knights, which, in my opinion, is a great shame because I would have enjoyed it immensely if Valette would have defeated him again.